Welcome to Bulletproof SharePoint Governance. My name is Nick Inglis. I'm one of the founding partners of Optismo. I'm the co-founder of the Information Governance Conference. I'm the author of the AIIM SharePoint Governance Toolkit, and most proudly, I'm the father of Connor, Adam Inglis. I want to take this time to thank the sponsors and the organizers of SP24 for making this happen. Without them, this wouldn't exist, and I thank them for the opportunity, and I thank you for voting for my session. Again, this is Bulletproof SharePoint Governance, and it's going to be an overview of the Optismo model of SharePoint Governance, a comprehensive model of SharePoint Governance that covers all of the areas that we find to be important for SharePoint Governance. To start us off, I want to first talk about what we're going to cover in this session. We'll begin with the foundational activities: information gathering, developing our foundational information, guiding strategy, and planning our implementation. And then what I'm going to go through is the governance areas for SharePoint Governance, starting with content, moving on to design and structure, development, people and roles, security, and classification. And we're going to go into each of these in serious depth. Now, all this begs the question, what exactly is SharePoint Governance? If you ask 10 experts, you're going to get at least 20 different answers. Now, why is it that we have such a hard time defining what SharePoint governance is? First off, governance is expansive, and it reaches all of the various parts of an organization. It's approached very differently by the various stakeholders to SharePoint governance. For some people, SharePoint governance is all about servers and development. For others, it's all about the information structure. For other groups, it's about the design and ensuring the design standards. All of these are parts of SharePoint governance, but are not the whole. So what is SharePoint governance? It is driven by your business requirements. First and foremost, you are defining what SharePoint governance is for your specific organization. Now at Optismo, what we've done through our consulting and our training work is we've developed a model that covers all of the areas that we generally see in SharePoint governance plans, covering content and how content is managed within SharePoint, the design and structure and branding guidelines, development, including the environments in which development is done and how code is deployed, people and roles, including what people do what within SharePoint, security, and ensuring that the SharePoint implementation is secure from various perspectives. Classification, including how content and sites are classified within the SharePoint environment. And we're going to dive into each of these in depth. But first, let's start with our foundational activities. Our foundational activities are created to make sure that we start off right. So we begin by gathering information about our organization, about our technology, about our systems. We gather that information from across our organization. We then take that information and we build our foundational information. This is a document that really explains where we're at and where we're going. And in that, we guide our strategy, we develop our strategy, and then we actually go through and implement our SharePoint governance plan, or even our SharePoint environment if we haven't done so already. This is a structured presentation, so throughout the presentation we'll have these signposts letting us know where we're at and where we're going. We're beginning with our foundational activities, talking about information gathering. Our information gathering phase is all about gathering data from across our organization to help us identify trends that will help us in the SharePoint governance planning process. One of the most critical activities that we're going to have here is developing representative user profiles. So what we'll do is we'll identify people that will be utilizing our SharePoint systems so that we can understand how they would, in fact, utilize the system. We'll later talk about our gap analysis mapping, so hold this one for a little while. But what we'll do is we'll align questions from our information gathering phase to our gap analysis mapping. And then what we'll do is we'll actually gather that information from across our organization. How we do that could be through one-on-one interviewing. It could be through email surveys or surveys in the organization. We could even do it through workshops. Once we've gathered that information, we'll then move on to our foundational information. Our foundational information is really here to help us establish and guide our strategy in the future. So this is the information that we need in order to propose and put forward a strategy for SharePoint governance. The first part of that is going to be establishing the role of SharePoint. Since SharePoint is a broad platform, it really can do anything that you want it to do. So starting out, you need to define what you want SharePoint to do, because if we don't define it and we leave it open to our users, SharePoint will be used for everything, and it won't be used for anything well. So you need to define it. SharePoint could be used as your development platform. It could be your content and information management platform. Maybe it's your social platform. Whatever you're going to use it for, make sure that you define what you will use it for. Likewise, we'll establish the role of cooperating systems. So what connects with SharePoint? How are we connecting it? Are we connecting it through data? Are we connecting it through the user interface? Are we connecting it through maybe process and workflow? We need to establish the roles of the systems that will cooperate with SharePoint as well. We're then going to take the results of our information gathering, those surveys or those workshops or those one-on-one interviews, to assess the maturity of our organization. And we'll do that in several categories. So it could be our systems and our technology. Maybe we're assessing the maturity of our culture and our readiness for maybe social as a component of SharePoint. We'll assess our compliance with various regulations. Whatever it is, we need to assess the maturity so that we can define what's most important in our implementation. And lastly in this phase, but far from the least important, we want to identify any external factors that might affect our SharePoint governance planning, including things like budget, various policies, maybe mergers and acquisitions activity, systems replacements, etc. We want to identify any external factors that may have a bearing on or an effect on our SharePoint governance planning activities. We'll then pull together all of this information into a single document, what we're going to call a foundational overview document. And that'll help us in determining our strategy. It'll also help us through our business case, and we can refer back to this document throughout the process of SharePoint governance planning. We then move on to guiding and developing strategy. Guiding and developing strategy, we're going to break it into 4 sections here. We're going to develop our guiding principles, we'll perform a reference architecture, we'll perform a gap analysis, and then we'll develop a technology roadmap. And let's go into each of these. We'll first develop our guiding principles. Now these are statements that encompass our overall program goals, our beliefs and desires about the program, our desired outcomes of the program, and any overarching themes or maybe even directives from the organization's management. A sample guiding principle may be, we'll develop policies that will ensure that information is easily findable within our systems. Now our reference architecture is a tool that maps various systems functionality to our enterprise systems, and it's going to help us identify functionality gaps that may exist within our current environment. It's going to help us identify systems that are available for standardization and even identify systems that we may want to consider for retirement. All of this in order to help us in our technology roadmap, which we'll be talking about in a moment. And we're still in our foundational activities, the gap analysis. So from our surveying, our interviewing, and our workshops, we identify areas for improvement in many areas. So things like culture. So here maybe we're talking about social readiness or preparedness. Functionality. Things like federated search capabilities. Our systems, etc. Our technology roadmap is a tool that helps us align our work with the long-term strategic goals of the IT organization and our infrastructure in the future. The technology roadmap, it identifies the long-term overall continuum of systems and technologies over the next 3 to 5 years, and it allows us to align ourselves to those long-term strategic goals. And moving on to the last step in our foundational activities, we're going to talk about implementing our SharePoint governance plan and or SharePoint overall. When talking through implementation planning, there are two key activities here that we want to understand. The first is that we need to document our requirements, and then we also need to develop a business case and gain approval for that business case from our executives. We'll first talk through documenting requirements. And it's important for us to leverage existing standards and methodologies that exist for documenting requirements like the IEEE Standard 830-1998 or UML or RUP. It doesn't matter what you use as long as you're utilizing an existing standard or methodology. When you are documenting your requirements, you want to number your requirements so that you can trace them over the course of the overall project and you can easily identify what has been achieved and what has not been achieved. Throughout documenting your requirements, you want to apply those guiding principles that we created earlier on. We want to document and list our assumptions, make them very clear, any assumptions that we make, so that others that are viewing our requirements document, they easily can understand what it is that we're talking about. We want to list our policy, our processes, our technical, legal, and regulatory constraints. We want to describe the functionality overall, not how functionality should be developed, but a description of the functionality. And we also want to prioritize and or categorize our requirements so that we can easily look at that document and understand what's most important in these requirements. We're then going to develop our business case and gain approval for that business case. Now, there are a lot of models and methodologies for developing a business case. I want you to utilize whatever model or methodology you're already using for business cases within your organization. But what I found is there are some key elements that are consistent no matter what model you're utilizing. So I'm going to present those here as sort of overarching categories that we find in most models for developing a business case. The first step of which is developing our rationale for our SharePoint governance activities. And our rationale can include things like productivity increases, overall knowledge management within the organization, improvements in compliance, ensuring risk management, legal and regulatory compliance, and reducing e-discovery costs, improving findability of information, and you may have many other reasons that would go into your rationale within your business case. The next section I call purpose, and this is the purpose behind our SharePoint governance planning. So it provides executives a justification of our actions. It gives them an evaluation of the options that are in front of us that we could take. It provides a full cost-benefit analysis over the course of whatever number of years are included in your business case, and that varies from organization to organization. You'll provide an outline of your commitments. You'll obtain your executive commitment, and you'll obtain your executive approval. And the next section we're going to talk through is outlining cost areas. Now, this SharePoint thing might be really cool, but it's not inexpensive in most organizations. So you want to outline the cost areas so that your executives can appropriate the amount of money that you need in order to execute on your SharePoint governance plan. Cost areas include things like your hardware, your software, the actual program execution itself, training provided not only to your staff that's implementing, but also to the overall organization as you make changes. Operations cost, and then the ongoing maintenance, which no one seems to remember about whenever they're developing their cost areas. And the last section of our business case is outlining the benefits. And this is where you really hammer home why it is that you need executive approval to move forward. So give them a dollar figure, the dollars that'll be saved, the time that'll be saved, costs that will be avoided in the long term, maintenance fees that'll be avoided by consolidating multiple systems or defining which systems are actually utilized, and you can retire old systems. However you can achieve and realize those benefits, it should be included here, really to bring things home for the executives so that they can make a wise decision and give you the resources that you need to move forward with SharePoint governance. And from here forward, we're going to be talking about the governance areas. And in the Optismo model of SharePoint governance, there are 6 key governance areas: content, design and user experience, development, people and roles, security, and classification. So without further ado, let's begin by talking about content. So without further ado, let's talk about content governance. So content governance, it's actually pretty expansive. It covers a lot of areas. So the first thing that we're going to talk through is the development and implementing retention policies across all organizational information, and I'll try not to put you asleep with that. We'll then talk about establishing content type structure and rules around content types. We'll then talk about standardization of metadata, or if you've been in the SharePoint world, standardization of columns. Depending upon where you come from, it's 2 ways to describe the exact same thing. We'll then talk about our library and list standards, and then we'll talk through site provisioning, which has gotten a lot better in 2013, but I still think we need to discuss it a little bit here. So the first part of content governance that I want to talk to you about is developing and implementing retention policies across all organizational information. And I'll try my best not to put you to sleep for this, as promised. Establishing rules for retention and disposition at the outset across all organizational information, it's going to help you in terms of managing compliance from the outset of your goals. You're going to develop overall categories and the length of time for which to keep those categories. So you'll align your categories based on retention rules and disposition rules for those categories. And you'll want to work with your records management and your compliance and legal and risk mitigation departments, whatever they're called within your organization. And you're going to automatically identify and categorize the information. And you'll achieve this by looking at the location. So when this piece of content was uploaded or created, what site collection was it in? What site was it in? What library was it in? What content types have been assigned, and what are the columns or metadata fields that have been applied to this piece of content? So for example, let's take a look at a piece of content that's been uploaded into our system. And this particular piece of content has been uploaded to the marketing site. It was uploaded to the operations library, and it was given the content type of a contract. Well, what do we know about this particular piece of information that's been uploaded into our system? Well, we know that it's a marketing contract. We can infer that right from the location, the content types, and the metadata that's attached. And then we can apply our business processes and policies to that. So whether we're moving things to a record center automatically based on that categorization, or we're applying our information management policies in place, we can do this by simply understanding and categorizing based on this up front. So based on the location, the content types, the columns, and the metadata fields, we can apply our information governance and information management policies to all organization, to the whole organizational information up front. And save ourselves a lot of time in establishing retention and disposition rules in the long run. But again, this is a project in itself, developing the categorization to automatically identify this content. Now let's talk about establishing our content type structure and our rules, and this is going to actually help us in our overall classification that we just talked about, because content types can actually help power a lot of this. So I'm going to show an example, because the best way to show this and teach this is to actually show an example. And this is a very, very simple example. But we have in this example a content type hub. We have some high-level content types. We have some children to those high-level content types. Now let's talk about the different types of content types that we have here, the categories, if you will. We have content types in which content cannot be added. They're essentially placeholders in which we can apply our hierarchical information management policies. And then we have other content types where we can, in fact, add content. So if we're looking at this mapping, content type A and content type B, we can add content. Those are placeholders. Content type C and content type D, we can upload content to those. Now, child content type B, this is an interesting one. So content type B, its parent, you can't add content. Content type child content type B, you can add content. So why do we have this content type B in there at all? Because we can apply our information management policies and help our users understand how these content types are to be used. In addition, we now are allowing our site administrators, generally the people that can do this, but we're allowing for content type extension. We're giving we're delegating out to our user population through our site administrators the ability to create new content types for their own purposes, but they're not going to create these content types from scratch because that'll mess up our entire organizational information management information architecture. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you site administrator A, you can now, instead of creating a new content type, you can extend a content type that I already have. That way you're getting the information management policies, the retention rules, the disposition rules, all of the attached metadata that I applied on this from an organizational perspective without screwing up my organizational information architecture. But you can now customize this and make it your own for your departmental needs. Does that make sense? So that's what we're going to do with our content types. So why are we setting up this hierarchical structure of our content types? Well, it's so that we can apply information management policies at the highest level possible. And this is just a quick, simple visualization of the things that can be applied hierarchically to a content type and passed down, and then even passed down to the extended content types created by our site administrator. So things like the scope, where is this applied? At the enterprise level, the site collection level, the site level? What are the columns or metadata that's attached? What are the term sets applied to those columns? Are they global? Are they local? What are the workflow requirements? Are we leveraging out-of-the-box workflow or custom workflow through a third party or whatever Microsoft comes out with next? Are we applying forms and document templates? We can apply those hierarchically. And what are the information management policies that we apply? Things like auditing, retention, disposition included in there as well, labeling, even print restrictions. All these can be applied at the content type level and then passed down hierarchically to the child content types. This is why structuring our content types right becomes really important, because we can automate so much through the use of our content types. So if we can do this at the outset and structure it right, we're saving ourselves a ton of time in the long term. All right, now let's talk about standardization of metadata, or our standardization of columns. We'll move away from content types for a moment. So what we want to do in our SharePoint governance plan is include our metadata or our column plan. So we'll want to categorize each of these columns as where they're applied at the enterprise level, the site collection level, or the site level. We'll also list out which site collection or site we're referring to with each set. We'll include our predefined term sets and terms, and frankly, Microsoft has a great term set worksheet that can be utilized for this. And then you'll show the relationship between the various term sets and site columns and include this in your SharePoint governance plan. You can also include a notes field to keep yourself organized. Now let's move on to establishing site provisioning. And let me be honest with you, when 2013 came out, I thought we would stop talking about site provisioning. The problem is, for those with SharePoint 2013, the built-in site provisioning process doesn't always align with the organizational requirements for site provisioning. And there's not a lot of options to modify that site provisioning process. For those with SharePoint 2010 or older, you need to go through and develop all the related forms, the workflows, and functions needed for site provisioning, and that has to be based on your business requirements. For those that are in 2013, you may need to do the same thing as well if the site provisioning process included out of the box with 2013 doesn't line up with what your organizational requirements are for site provisioning. You should actually think through this, not just accept that Microsoft has the answer with SharePoint 2013. It has a great answer, but not always the best for every organization. So, as an example of site provisioning, an authorized user, generally a site administrator, will request a new site. They've got a form that is filled out providing the details of usage or intended usage of the site to be created. The request is evaluated by someone handling fulfillment, and you'll need to define the roles, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then the site is created based on a predefined site template. Do not create these on the fly from scratch every single time. Establish your site templates. We'll talk about that in a bit as well. Or it's denied. Either way, we want to send a message to the authorized user who initially requested the site to let them know why we did not create the site and give them the details about it. As we talk about site templates, we'll talk about all of the things that can be applied on site templates, which is why I say you must do this site provisioning process based off of site templates. Do not do this from scratch on the fly each time, putting together all the various web parts. Do this work up front, which is why SharePoint governance, again, is incredibly important. Alright, that does it for content governance, and we're going to move on to design and user experience. And you're going to see some ways that these governance areas overlap, because there is no linear process to do SharePoint governance. Because it's unique in each and every organization, all I can do is give you categories and try and guide you. But there is no linear process. So let's dive into design and user experience. Alright, let's talk design and user experience. So what we're going to first talk about is establishing our site organization. We're going to move on to establishing branding. We're going to move on to establishing site templates, which become incredibly important, as I mentioned before, to carry common permissions and functionality out to the organization as a whole. We're going to establish our navigation rules, and then we're going to establish our search configuration rules. And all of this is done in the SharePoint governance process. So the first step in the design and user experience section is establishing our site organization. And what we're going to do is, from a high level, from an organizational perspective, we're going to develop our primary site collection and site organizations. We're also going to establish where new sites will be created within the organizational hierarchy as displayed through SharePoint. So in this example that's shown here, there are 3 different site collections, and we dive into one of them. There are 2 different divisions within that site collection. Those would be sites. And then we have some subsites here for R&D, marketing, sales, and product management. And then we are also establishing where new sites can be created through that site provisioning process that we talked about before, where our site administrators can say, yes, I need a particular site. Here's the purpose of it. And then I know where it's going to exist within this site organizational hierarchy because it's already defined through the SharePoint governance planning process. Next, we're going to establish our branding guidelines. Now, I am not a SharePoint branding guru, but I do know that each organization has different branding guidelines which are applied to SharePoint. And in your SharePoint governance planning, you need to establish, leveraging those corporate branding guidelines for SharePoint. And you will leverage your site templates to carry those guidelines to all sites within your SharePoint structure and throughout the organization automatically. And again, we're going to talk about site templates in some depth in a moment. But we do want to establish branding within our SharePoint governance plan. So let's talk about those site templates. In establishing site templates to carry common permissions and functionality. In design and user experience, we're going to create these various site templates to meet specific organizational needs. So we may have, a project template, a team site template, etc. With each template, we'll establish all of our permissions and functionality to go with those templates so that we're disseminating our common enterprise standards throughout the SharePoint environment automatically. Things that we can add to site templates and automatically populate are things like our branding guidelines, which we just talked about, our information architecture, our content types and metadata, our support levels even, which we'll talk about in a bit, our records management policies and our retention and disposition processes, even our site disposition process to eventually dispose of all sites that are created based on rules and workflow that can be established up front. As you're seeing here, site templates and establishing common permissions and functionality through site templates become a strong and easy way to pass SharePoint governance throughout the organization. So it's best to establish these up front prior to the rollout of SharePoint. In addition, we want to establish our navigation rules in the design and user experience section. We'll establish navigation rules for our primary menus and how those menus are inheritable through our newly provisioned sites and through our site templates. Now moving on to establishing search configuration rules. Now the easiest way to get your SharePoint implementation to fail is to establish no search configuration rules. Your user base relies on search to be effective for recovering and finding the information that they have uploaded into SharePoint. So in your SharePoint governance plan, you'll list the appropriate crawl schedule information, or at least the relative importance of various categories of sites so that they can be aligned with the crawl schedule. You'll include your predefined crawl schedule information based on your site provisioning process and your site templates. Some questions to ask yourself. What is your process and schedule for mining tagged information to add information to your term store in Thesaurus? So those tags that users are adding, they can be incredibly insightful on how you can implement those tags into your enterprise information architecture by adding those to the term store and understanding how language is being used within your organization. Another question, what is your policy on when best bets may be used? Define that up front. What external sources of data will be connected with search? How are we connecting them with search? Are we federating search? Are we including two search result panes side by side? You can do all of that with SharePoint, so establish how those sources of data will be connected with SharePoint and SharePoint Search. Establish your schedule for continuous search improvement. Search, it can work right out of the box, but you want it to work really well. You need to go back and identify how search can be improved over the long term. And finally, who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for managing search and following your search improvement schedule? What team? What are the roles around that? And we'll talk more about role definition in a bit. But here are some questions to help you establish the search configuration rules and processes in your organization through your SharePoint governance plan. All right, design and user experience, it's been real. We're moving on to development for our governance area that is coming now. So let's talk development governance. In this section, we're going to talk about establishing your SharePoint environment rules. We're going to talk about establishing your code deployment process, and we're going to talk about establishing your ongoing server management plan. And just an FYI, a caveat here, I am not a developer. Work with your development team to understand your specific development and business requirements. I'm going to give you the broad strokes, but the specifics, you're going to have to work with your business and your developer team to actually nail the specifics for your organization. So let's begin by talking about establishing your SharePoint environment rules, and this is really simple. Establish your rules around SharePoint environments. For development, testing, and production, you should have at least 3 different environments. You'll most likely also have a 4th for staging, but you need to have at least 3, and you want to establish your rules and include those in your SharePoint governance plan. Pretty straightforward, right? And next, you will want to establish your code deployment processes. Now, you may have different processes based on the type of code and the process for which it goes through before it ends up in your production environment. You may have one process for code that is developed in-house. You may have a different process for purchase solutions from third-party partners of Microsoft, third-party providers. And you may have a completely different process for codeless solutions, things that are created with solutions like SharePoint Designer. You need to establish those code deployment processes and list them in your SharePoint governance plan. And next, in your development governance section, you'll establish your ongoing server management plan. So you'll establish or list your primary server topologies. You'll establish or list your applications and your application pools. You'll align those with where they will be utilized within your site hierarchy. And then you'll establish or list your storage architecture. Now, this is not a moot point if you're using a cloud-based solution for SharePoint. So whether it's Office 365 or a hosted solution outside of your company's servers. Essentially, with a cloud-based deployment, what you're going to do is you're going to align your business objectives, list out your business objectives, and then list out how the cloud applications align with those business objectives and include that in your SharePoint governance plan. All right, and that concludes development governance. Now let's talk about the people and roles within your SharePoint implementation and how that gets included into your SharePoint governance plan. All right, with people and roles, what we're going to do is we're going to establish or list our permissions groups. We're going to establish support channels and the roles in providing support to our organization and our users. We will establish group-based or categorized training requirements. And we will establish roles in SharePoint maintenance. We're going to do all of that within the people and roles section here. So to begin, we're going to establish our permissions groups. And we will establish the primary permissions groups or list them in our SharePoint governance plan. Now, some organizations treat this in the same manner that we were talking about content types earlier, where they provide room in their hierarchy for extending specific permissions as to not create new permissions groups, but rather extend and apply the same principles through the hierarchical structure of user permissions groups. Now, I don't have the time to actually explain how you decide and determine your permissions groups, but you can simply Google or Bing that. There's a lot of great advice out there from Microsoft and other experts, including other experts that are in this session with SP24. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but let's move forward. You will establish your permissions, and you will include them in your SharePoint governance plan. Moving on to establishing support channels and roles. I think the best way to do this is to leverage your site templates to establish various tiered levels of support that are related to the site template and the importance of the site itself. So your site establishes the mode of support that is available. The site template is a way to apply that to the site level. You'll establish your groups to provide support, you'll establish your modes of support, and you'll establish your support metrics. So I'll show an example here of a 3-tiered support roles. You'll have email available for, say, site templates A, B, and C. You'll have chat available for site templates A and B. And phone support is available by support tech invitation only once they've gone through either support tier 3 or support tier 2 in this particular example. But establishing it on the site template allows you to propagate that throughout your SharePoint environment really, really easily. Next, in people and roles, we'll establish group-based training requirements. So we'll establish the training requirements by user group. And some of the user groups, just some examples of user groups that might be in your organization are farm administrators, developers, end users, site admins, etc. Each of those different groups, they're going to have different requirements for training. So you need to establish those training requirements up front so that you can ensure that people have the knowledge and information they need to perform in their role related to SharePoint as best they can. And finally, in people and roles, you'll establish the role in SharePoint's ongoing maintenance. And this is not something you want to overlook, even if you are on the cloud or in the cloud. Your roles for SharePoint's ongoing maintenance could include things like search configuration, site provisioning, support, user onboarding, user decommissioning, records management, etc., etc., etc. You want to establish the roles that are relevant to your business and your business requirements. And just like that, we're back to the governance areas. We're moving from people and roles over to security. And with regard to security, we're going to focus on permissions inheritance and divergence, the roles for administration hierarchy, and permissions group creation rules to ensure security is pushed throughout the organization and the SharePoint environment. So starting with permissions inheritance and divergence. For permissions, we're defining who has access to what. Now, I have struggled with this when I've just had an Excel spreadsheet in front of me and I'm trying to define my various permissions group. See, I'm a visual person, so let's think about this very practically. What I do is I take my site structure chart, which I've already created. I've set up my sites, or I've established the site hierarchy. And then what I do is I start to simply draw circles, creating groups of permissions. I then use those points of divergence to get more granular. So I'm asking myself questions like, okay, does this person in Department A have access to the stuff from Department B? Does the person from Department B have access to the stuff from Department A? Is it the same user group? Is it a different user group? And then I make circles all over my site hierarchy. It just works for me. And then I take that and I put it into spreadsheet form, and I list my groups by their permission access to inform what the user groups will actually be and the permissions will actually be when we establish them inside of SharePoint. Everyone gets all of the user permissions on the end user side, but oftentimes we're forgetting about the roles for administration. So administration likewise should have a specific hierarchy and access roles. So we can utilize inheritance to establish our administrator roles and the various sets of permissions. And to this regard, Microsoft has a really useful administrators and owners worksheet that can be utilized to help you along this process. It's a really, really great resource, and you can Google or Bing that and it'll come right up for you. Moving on to permissions group creation rules, don't forget to establish a set of rules around the creation or modification of user permissions groups to be followed by your administrative team, the people that are going to be able to go in and modify user permissions. You should have a process and defined roles around that to ensure security. And that does it for security with regards to SharePoint governance. Mind you, you're going to have a lot more security work that you're going to be doing. However, you're not going to list that in a SharePoint governance plan because you're going to want to make this plan available for others to see and utilize. So in terms of SharePoint governance, we're all set with security. You're likely going to have more work that you're going to do. All right, moving on, we're going to move into classification and classification governance. For classification governance, what we're going to be doing is establishing consistent classification, establishing content type groups, manage metadata service rules and usage, the content type hub rules and use, and how to leverage the content organizer to help us with automation. First, let's talk about establishing consistent classification. Now in this is all about establishing classification or naming standards. And if we have these rules, they're generally going to come from our records management team or directly from a specific regulation that's required. Organizations that are in highly regulated sectors generally have these rules. Now, you may or may not have any classification or naming standards that are required. That's fine. If you're in a regulated sector, you might have to follow specific rules in terms of classification and naming standards. And in applying those into SharePoint, we want to ensure that that's a part of our SharePoint governance plan. Next in classification governance is establishing content type grouping. And content type grouping is something that I do. It's not something that everyone does, but I generally utilize this to ensure compliance with records and disposition standards. So I'll have a high-level content type, and then I'll have content types below it. I apply my retention and disposition standards on the highest level possible, and then apply those disposition and retention standards through the content type hierarchy so that they're propagated throughout the organization. And I generally establish my overall groups by the length of time for which the information must be retained. And then I'll use points of divergence through the content types to apply different policies like workflow and maybe print restrictions or auditing standards to define those sub-content types further. Now, this is something that you can utilize or you cannot utilize. It depends on how you're doing records management and your retention and disposition of information as well in your SharePoint environment. But I suggest you at least think this through as a potential strategy for managing your information inside of SharePoint. And next is the Managed Metadata Service rules and usage. This is simply defining the processes and usage restrictions for adding or changing classification terms in the Managed Metadata Service and term store. It is straightforward and simple as that. And next is Content Type Hub rules and usage. So this is defining the processes and usage restrictions for adding or changing enterprise content types, much like we just talked about with metadata. We're defining the process and usage restrictions for extending enterprise content types. Who gets to extend? Generally, for me, this is the site admins that are able to extend, but you may have different business requirements. And it may be helpful to list some example scenarios for which the adds and edits may be made. So you'll establish also the approval and workflow required to make changes if you have that as a business requirement. And to round out classification, we're going to be talking about leveraging the content organizer. So this is establishing automation through the use of the content organizer, and it can be incredibly useful for records management processes, workflow fulfillment, publishing processes, etc., etc., etc. There's so many uses for the content organizer to move content from point A to point B, rules-based. So what we'll do is we'll establish the rules and the roles for the usage of the content organizer, at least for the primary enterprise processes. And we'll define the content organizer criteria for those primary enterprise processes and any usage that's in conjunction with workflow and or forms. Here it's all about maximizing the content organizer for automation, however those processes play out for your business requirements and what's needed to equip your organization for automation. And with that, we've talked through all 6 areas for SharePoint governance planning. So as a recap of all of the information that we went through today on SP24, in a very short period of time, less than an hour, we talked about our foundational activities of information gathering, foundational information, guiding strategy, and implementation planning. For information gathering, we established representative user profiles, we aligned questions to our gap analysis mapping, and we gathered the information through one-on-one interviewing, surveys, and or workshops. For foundational information, we talked about establishing the role of SharePoint, the role of other cooperating systems, assessing maturity, and identifying external factors, all of which gets wrapped up into a foundational overview document that we can utilize throughout our governance planning. For guiding strategy, we talked about developing guiding principles, developing a reference architecture, performing a gap analysis, and then creating, leveraging, and aligning to a technology roadmap. And then for implementation planning, we talked about documenting requirements and developing and gaining approval for a business case. We then spent some time going through the 6 categories of SharePoint governance in the optimal model of SharePoint governance, including content, design and structure, development, people and roles, security, and finally classification. For content, we talked through developing and implementing retention policies across all organizational information. We talked through establishing content type structure and rules, standardizing metadata or columns. We talked about developing library and list standards and the potential of site provisioning. For design and user experience, we talked about establishing site organization, establishing branding guidelines specific to SharePoint. We talked about establishing our site templates to automatically carry common permissions and functionality, and how completely awesome that can be. We talked through establishing navigation rules and establishing search configuration rules. For development governance, I assured you that I am not, in fact, a SharePoint developer, but that development governance should establish your SharePoint environment rules, establish your code deployment process, and establish your ongoing server management plan, even if you are in the cloud. For people and roles, we talked through establishing permissions groups, establishing support channels and roles, and applying them wherever possible to site templates, establishing group-based training requirements, and establishing the roles in SharePoint maintenance, and to not ignore them even if you are in the cloud. For security, we talked through permissions inheritance and divergence, roles for admin hierarchy, and permissions group creation rules. And finally, we just wrapped up with classification, talking through establishing consistent classification, establishing content type groups, rules and use of the managed metadata service, the rules and use of the content type hub, and applying automation through the use of the content organizer. And we did all of that in less than an hour. And with that, I want to thank you, the folks listening in on this presentation today, for sticking with me despite a ton of information in a short period of time. I want to thank the organizers of SP24 for putting together such a great worldwide free SharePoint event. And lastly, but most importantly, I want to thank the sponsors of SP24, without whom this could not possibly be free for us all to enjoy and share. So make sure to check out their companies and what they're doing and how they help companies in the SharePoint space. I'm Nick Inglis, and I'm one of the founding partners of Optismo, a leading education, consulting, and research firm who also put on the Information Governance Conference here in the U.S. I spend most of my time helping organizations grapple with SharePoint governance and helping them develop well-functioning, well-structured, and well-governed SharePoint environments that are aligned with their organizational objectives. You can learn more about me and my company, Optismo, at optismo.com. Thank you once again, and I'm glad to answer any questions that you may have from today's presentation.